Hi, this is Jeff West, and I'd like to give you an overview and a demo of Java EE shared libraries on WebLogic. Before I show the demo, I'd like to give an overview of Java EE shared libraries on WebLogic and WebLogic's class loaders. There are two options for using libraries with the applications that you deploy to WebLogic. The first is packaging jar files and/or class files in an enterprise archive as you deploy to WebLogic. You can put these files in a WAR file or an EAR file and then deploy them on the app server. Another option is to use Java EE shared libraries. This allows you to deploy a jar, EAR, or WAR file with metadata about the library such that you can reference it from other applications that are deployed to WebLogic. This is simple and straightforward and enables you to be creative in your build process. For example, when you release a new version of a particular jar or application module, you can deploy it to the server without making changes to the other applications that use it. You can also deploy multiple versions of the same library in parallel for testing purposes. Class loaders typically take a top-down approach when loading classes from the class path. If the top-level class loader cannot find a class, it will delegate to the next class loader in the hierarchy. There are several levels of class loaders that are used in WebLogic. Obviously, there's a top-level system class loader that loads the WebLogic implementation classes and supporting libraries defined on the class path. There's also a domain-level class loader that loads classes that are placed in the lib folder of the domain. However, generally speaking, WebLogic class loading is centered on the concept of applications. An application is normally packaged as an enterprise archive or EAR file containing application classes and libraries. Everything within an EAR file is considered to be part of the same application. If you deploy an EJB jar and a web application separately, then they're considered to be two different applications and will have two different application class loaders. WebLogic Server automatically creates a hierarchy of class loaders when an application is deployed. The root class loader in this hierarchy loads any EJB jar files in the application. A child class loader is also created for each application or WAR file. So why did we do this? It is common for web applications to call EJBs, and the WebLogic Server application architecture allows JSPs and servlets to see EJB interfaces in their parent class loader. This allows for EJBs to be called by reference for higher performance. This architecture also allows web applications to be redeployed without redeploying the EJBs here. If you deploy the WAR and jar files separately, WebLogic Server creates sibling class loaders from them, and this means that you have to do some additional work to have your JSPs and servlets hit your EJBs. However, this changes a bit with EE6 since you can package EJBs in WAR files. Let's take a look at what's required to use shared libraries on WebLogic. First, a shared library can be any one of the following: a standalone EJB module, a standalone web application module, or multiple EJB and/or WAR modules packaged in a single enterprise application. Libraries can also be a single plain jar file. When you deploy a shared library, you must include a manifest that includes the following fields: the extension name or library name, the specification version, and the implementation version. WebLogic supports two levels of versioning for shared Java EE libraries. The specification version identifies the version number of the specification to which a Java EE library conforms, and the implementation version identifies the version number of the actual code implementation for the library or package. For example, this will correspond to the actual revision number or release number of your code. If you specify an implementation version, you also must specify a specification version. As a best practice, Oracle recommends that you always include version information when creating Java shared libraries. Creating and updating version information as you develop shared components allows you to deploy multiple versions of those components simultaneously for testing. If you include no version information, or fail to increment the version string, then you must undeploy existing libraries before you can deploy the newer one. In order to reference a shared library in WebLogic, you must use WebLogic deployment descriptors, either the weblogic.xml file for WAR files or the WebLogic-application.xml file for EAR files. Here you specify the library name, specification version, and implementation version. WebLogic Server supports versioning of shared Java EE libraries so that referencing applications can specify a required minimum version of the library to use or an exact required version, which is controlled by the exact match field. Next, I'd like to show you how you can build and deploy a Java EE shared library. I will be using Maven for this example since I already have a project structure that I can modify to use shared libraries instead of packaging a jar file with an EAR file that I'll be deploying. I'll also be using the WebLogic Maven plugin to deploy my library by using the Maven deploy goal. First, what I want to show you is that I am using properties to define my library specification and implementation versions. The great thing about using a build tool like Ant or Maven with shared libraries is that you can automatically increment the build number and implementation version and keep them in sync. This allows you to tie your applications to a specific implementation version of the library from your build repository. Here you'll see that I'm using the Maven jar plugin to dynamically create a manifest. WebLogic only requires the library specification, library implementation, and extension name fields be set, but I'm also defining some extra fields here. Next, I'd like to show you the WebLogic Maven plugin configuration. I'm defining the plugin management section, I define the plugin in the plugin management section of the parent project so that I can configure a default set of parameters that I can use in child projects. You'll see that I'm defining standard fields like the admin URL, username, and password, in addition to specifying the path to the artifact and specifying remote deployment options. Looking back at the POM file for the project, you'll see that I'm making a reference to the plugin by name and adding an additional configuration parameter where I specify that I want to deploy a library. So what's happening here is the default parameters that I set in the parent project are all being inherited by the child project. You also see that I define different profiles here for different deployment scenarios that I can deploy to my local machine and a few other locations as well. So let's take a look at the deployments that I have in WebLogic right now. You'll see that I have the ops-util library already deployed, but this is implementation version 2.0.1, and I'll be deploying 2.0.2. So let's go ahead and deploy the library version using Maven. So it's a small library, so it should go pretty quickly. Here you'll see the specification and implementation version that have been deployed for this library. So now when I go back and look in the WebLogic console and refresh the screen, we'll see that I now have implementation version 2.0.2. So let's take a look at the deployment descriptor of the EAR file that I'm going to be deploying. Here you see I specify the library name and specification and implementation versions again. Note that I'm specifying implementation version 2.0.1, not 2.0.2. But since I have exact match set to false, it will use the latest version for that specification. So in this case, when I deploy the EAR file, it will use version 2.0.2, not 2.0.1. So let's go ahead and get ready to deploy that. But first, I actually want to show you the POM file for this project. So here I'm specifying the EAR plugin, and the way that this works is that I'm specifying my EJB and web modules here, and then all the other modules or libraries that are dependencies of this project will be included as libraries. So if we look down for ops-util, we'll see here that I'm specifying a scope as provided. What this means is that I'm saying this dependency will be provided at runtime, and therefore it should not be included in the EAR file when it is created. So I'm going to go ahead and run the clean and deploy for this ear file, and we'll go ahead and deploy it. Here you see the build is successful, and now if I go back to my deployment screen, I should see a new application here that represents my ear file. And here it is. So now what I want to do is show you the ClassLoader analysis tool where we can see the libraries that are being used by the application. So I'll select the ops-jax-ear file, I'll enable the detailed view, and then look at the ClassLoader tree. Here we can see the system level class loaders and the application level class loaders. Here you'll see the library that's being used. So I'm using the ops-util specification 2.0 and implementation 2.0.2 version. So here when I deployed it, it took the most recent version of the library that's available for the specification version that I supplied. So I'd like to show you what happens when you try to undeploy an application or a library that has applications that are using it. So if you try to delete it, which means undeploy, you'll see here that it says the library is being referenced by one or more applications. So in order to delete this library, I first must delete my application. And only after I delete all the applications that are using a library will WebLogic allow me to actually delete that library. So now when I go in and delete my library, it will be successful. So there you go. Now I've been able to delete my library. Next, I'd like to show you how to deploy a jar file manually. First, let's take a look at the jar file that was built. This one was built using Maven, but you can use the standard jar command or ant or something else to build it as well if that's what you prefer. So here's the manifest that was generated. We can see the extension name, implementation version, and specification version. So next what I'm going to do is deploy this as a standalone library manually to WebLogic. In order to do this, I need to upload the file. And select the file here. Choose the cluster and click Finish. Okay, so now we see it deploy initializing down here. Activate the changes. That's how you deploy a library instead of an application in WebLogic. You can find more information about WebLogic online on the Oracle Technology Network or YouTube. We also have a Twitter account and Facebook account, and we are interested in your feedback. Thanks.